A new F1 season inevitably means a new controversy involving FIA President Mohammed Ben Sulayem, this time exposed by guidelines that mean a driver could be banned or deducted championship points for misconduct. Changes have been made to the main overarching rulebook that governs world motorsport, the International Sporting Code, to add guidelines for stewards to impose penalties when drivers swear, speak ill of FIA officials, or get too critical of the governing body. A version of this has existed previously by outlining good conduct, which didn't go into as much detail or outline any severity of punishment. So you might argue the addition is good for transparency and consistency, and the FIA certainly thinks that. But the fact it caught a lot of people in F1 by surprise and immediately sparked criticism from fans online shows this is not as straightforward as you wanted clarity, here's the clarity, this is just good governance. It's the latest in various Ben Sulayem related sagas, and how you interpret it probably depends on which side you're on. To many observers, it's another example of his FIA being overly draconian. To those specifically concerned by how the FIA is pushing through such changes in this regime, it's another example of unnecessary force and slyness. To others, it's another step in a clampdown with decent intentions that's not been handled very well. But to Ben Sulayem and his backers, the negative reaction is totally unjustified and could just be further evidence of the president being maliciously undermined by critics, especially the British media. Before we dig further into the reasons behind this and where it leaves the F1 versus FIA tensions that have been bubbling away for what feels like an eternity, we should clarify exactly what's at risk now. 5 specific items are listed in the new document outlining the prescribed penalties for various breaches of the ISC. For example, causing moral injury or loss to the FIA or its officials now carries a prescribed first offence penalty of €10,000. You may remember Günther Steiner, the old Haas team principal, getting in trouble for this at the 2023 Spanish Grand Prix when he called for full-time professional stewards because we still have laymen deciding on the fate of people who invest millions into their careers. It's also outlined in the document that multipliers are to be applied to the base fine depending on the competition level, with a specific tier reserved for F1 where base fines should be multiplied by 4. So causing moral injury or loss to the FIA as an F1 driver may now carry a penalty of €40,000 on the first offence, €80,000 on the second offence, plus a suspended 1-month suspension, and €120,000 on the third offence, plus an actual 1-month suspension and a deduction of an unspecified amount of championship points. The same penalty structure now applies to any public incitement to violence or hatred, as well as any misconduct. This is incredibly vaguely defined in the ISC, as in particular but not limited to the general use of language that is offensive, insulting, coarse, rude or abusive. The Max Verstappen swearing fine during last year's Singapore Grand Prix weekend that so incensed F1 drivers was issued due to a breach of that very misconduct rule. There are worries that this is too far-reaching. Considering the prospect of race bans is on the table, it's relevant to consider that what one person deems to be rude may not be universally shared, especially as the guidelines lay out a 2-year period where multiple offences lead to the escalation in sanctions. Swearing just 3 times in press conferences over 2 seasons could mean a 1-month ban and a €120,000 fine. There are few offences on the sporting side that are punished this harshly. Even the FIA approach to driver penalty points is that the totting up process relates to a 12-month period, and even then, it's only a 1-race ban for repeat offenders. So far, Kevin Magnussen's the only driver to get a ban in this way. Displays of political, religious and personal statements or comments notably in violation of the general principle of neutrality promoted by the FIA are also to be fined and penalised under the same new structure. As well as a further swearing clampdown, you could easily interpret that to be an extension of the gagging order effectively imposed on drivers a couple of years ago by putting a more specific and severe cost on using their platform at a race weekend to raise awareness of an issue important to them. It's worth noting that the guidelines do state that FIA stewards have the authority to decide what penalty to enforce and retain the discretion to take into account any mitigating and/or aggravating circumstances, as well as the nature and the location of the event. These are guidelines, after all, not something specifically enshrined in F1's own rules, but more often than not, guidelines like these do get adhered to and become more of a set menu of penalties. 2 ongoing themes are at play here: the relationship between the FIA and drivers, and the way Ben Sulayem is running things. The tough approach taken with the guidelines fits in with his hardline stance on many matters, especially driver behaviour. This came to a head in Singapore last year when, after Ben Sulayem said he wanted to see drivers swear less, Verstappen got punished. While Ben Sulayem's crusade has earned him some criticism and led to F1 drivers group, the Grand Prix Drivers Association, calling him out personally, he's remained defiant. Unsurprisingly, he's refused to back down, and if anything, he continues to escalate things. That's done behind an assertion that his only focus is on doing what he feels is best for FIA members, and that he is duty-bound to ensure rules are respected and enforced. The introduction of the guidelines is seen as the next step in this push. Going public with the guidelines is, the FIA claims, motivated by a desire to enhance transparency and consistency in the decision-making process. In its eyes, laying out advice on the type of sanctions that should be given should help avoid scenarios like last year's, where many didn't understand why Verstappen was given a day's community service for what he did in Singapore, while Charles Leclerc got away with a fine for using similar words in Mexico. In terms of the scale of the sanctions, Ben Sulayem has long argued that F1 needs to fall in line with other sports like football and American football, which punish players for misconduct. America's NFL does impose fines for such rule breaches, and these are not totally out of kilter with the scale of penalties that have been laid down in the FIA guidelines for F1. But there is a critical difference. The NFL fine schedule is an agreement between the governing body, which is the NFL, and the NFL Players Association, so there's a degree of proper consultation with participants on the matter. This is something that hasn't happened in F1 because it was done without any recent detailed discussion with drivers for a final sign-off, and this is the first area of unease about what's happened. The new stewards guidelines follow obvious tensions between drivers and Ben Sulayem at the end of 2024. When the GPDA published a critical statement, part of the problem was how they felt they were being treated. The drivers called on Ben Sulayem to treat them like adults, said they wanted to work with all of F1 stakeholders to make the championship better, and emphasised that the GPDA has, on countless occasions, expressed its view that driver monetary fines are not appropriate for our sport. They also called upon the FIA president to share the details and strategy of how such fines are allocated and where the funds are spent. That hasn't just been ignored, it's been rebuffed several times with a pretty harsh tone. Ben Sulayem chose not to respond to the GPDA directly, but said in an interview late last year it was none of their business. He told them to go and concentrate on driving, because authority figures telling sportspeople to shut up and do X is never a bad look. Though the GPDA says it has no interest in a public war, its hope that things would move on in a positive way has been shattered by the tough new guidelines. They have come out of the blue for drivers and were put in place without any recent detailed consultation. The FIA argues that during a meeting in Qatar last year, one of the mandates it was given by the drivers was to give clearer guidelines and impose punishments that acted as proper deterrents. And there's no requirement in the FIA statutes for it to discuss such changes to the regulations or code with drivers. So procedurally, there's nothing underhand here, but critics of this method, which includes some within the FIA who disagree with Ben Sulayem's leadership style, believe it shows the complete lack of desire to compromise and collaborate. Strong leadership welcomes dissenting voices and takes criticism on board. Weak leadership shuts that out in totality and claims it's being strong and righteous at the same time. Despite all that's gone on, Ben Sulayem's regime really wants you to believe that all is well at his FIA, that there's no personnel crisis, no rift between him and the drivers, no question mark over its capacity to regulate or its commitment to transparent governance. The fact is that after a period of relative stability on the surface, the cracks between Ben Sulayem's regime and F1 are growing again. There are plenty of examples beyond the misconduct saga, like the drip feed of high-profile exits. And tensions feel greater than at any point since early in Ben Sulayem's presidency, when ironically he was inheriting a mess rather than causing it, and there was open talk from high-level F1 personnel about whether the championship needed to go it alone and find another body to regulate it. The prospect of an F1 FIA split gradually faded, but the two sides always felt on the brink of war, especially when Ben Sulayem waded into commercial matters or F1 CEO Stefano Domenicali talked about rule changes. There's been an uneasy truce for a while, but if Ben Sulayem continues on his current trajectory, this could come to a head in 2025. Another problem exposed by the new misconduct guidelines is the way that some feel the vote was effectively pushed through the World Motorsport Council, the FIA's main rulemaking body, at Ben Sulayem's behest. It follows a trend towards more virtual meetings, quicker votes, less consultation, and a concern that proper due diligence is being sacrificed. E-votes do fulfil the letter of the legislative process in that the majority need to back changes for them to go through. And the FIA's position is there was nothing underhand in the way that these guidelines were put to an e-vote. They say it was just a case of many issues falling between the gaps of the most recent meeting in December 2024 and the next one in February this year. But we know there is unease about things not operating in the way some feel a proper democracy should, with open discussion and more time to debate things. And we understand that one of those who didn't vote in favour of the new proposal was F1 CEO Stefano Domenicali, which is a rare move as F1 doesn't usually abstain from voting. The whisper of discomfort about the way that some feel the FIA's democratic processes are being bypassed is especially interesting because it comes at the start of a presidential election year. For a long time, it seemed almost certain that Ben Sulayem would be unopposed to win a second term. As dissatisfaction grows, there's even a first hint that may no longer be the case.